really like start to look outside of yourself, your organization, and think about what's happening in the world as well as what's happening in your business and how that's influencing. I know in the report they cited some CEOs who talked about all the financial pressure that they're under. And if you think about everything that CEOs have been through since 2020 and the start of the pandemic, they just are feeling battered. And they talked about this in the report. They're really feeling beaten up and battered. And, there is that phrase that it's lonely at the top.
This is the Leadership Foundry Podcast. I'm your host this week, Brandon Smith. And for our topic this week, we're going to take on an evergreen topic, a topic we've talked about before in the past, but we're going to take a slightly different spin on it. We're going to talk about empathy, and empathy as leaders, for leaders, and how we model that in the organization. And to help us on that journey, I've got my guest, Rob Volpe. Rob is an empathy activist. I've had him on my podcast, The Workplace Therapist Show. He's going to come on and he's going to talk a little bit more about how we can do this even more effectively. Rob is the author of the book, Tell Me More About That, Solving the Empathy Crisis One Conversation at a Time, which won the Silver Benjamin Franklin Award for Best Self-Help Book. So Rob is really a passionate speaker and frankly activist around this. And we're going to talk specifically about the challenges of CEOs and leaders and some of the pressures they have. Rob's going to share some important data around how many leaders today are suffering from anxiety, depression, loneliness, and frankly, burnout, and what we can be doing as leaders to not only care for ourselves, but model that for the organization. So listen real close to some of Rob's points. He had some really great tips for us on how we can do that effectively and still maintain our position as CEOs and leaders. So, of course, stay tuned to the very end when I'll share some of my highlights. And just like with all of these shows, be really thinking about what's that one takeaway for you. Rob, so good to have you really back on one of my shows. So for listeners that may remember, I had you on the Workplace Therapist Show several years ago to introduce your book. And we had a great conversation about empathy. And now, when I saw a post you did recently around leaders, particularly dealing with mental health, loneliness, and challenges, I thought, wow, it'd be great to have you come back on and talk about such an important topic of empathy and self-care for leaders. So thank you for coming on the show.
Brandon, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, always good to see you. So for folks that maybe aren't familiar with you and your work, or maybe have forgotten, shame on them if they have, share a little bit more about yourself. Would love to maybe catch up some of those folks and refresh them, and also introduce you to new listeners.
Absolutely. Well, and it's been a minute since I've been on the show and talking with you. So I think I can have grace with the people that don't remember me. But I'm Rob Volpe. I'm the empathy activist. I'm based in San Francisco. And what does it mean to be an empathy activist? I help people find the courage to be a little more empathetic in their day-to-day life, whether that's at work or at home. And so practically that means I do speaking and trainings with leadership teams, with functions at organizations, or sometimes an entire organization, to help them understand, demystify empathy, really, understand what it is, what it isn't, to understand that it's not something you should be afraid of to show up and use at work, to counter some of those myths. And then the 5 steps to empathy, which is what my book is all about, which helps you overcome the barriers to being more empathetic.
So thank you for the intro. That's fantastic. And I love the work you do and the work that you've done in your career.
Thank you.
Before we jump into how this might relate to leaders, as you were talking, it struck me, wow, I'd love to hear Rob's latest and greatest definition on empathy. So when you think about, when someone says, well, Rob, what does it mean to be empathetic? What do you typically tell them?
So, typically I'll ask them how they define empathy. I won't do that right at this moment, but I would ask the listeners and viewers, how would you define empathy? And I would guess that there's one of 3 answers that are coming up. One is about connecting with the perspective, or seeing the perspective, or understanding the perspective of somebody else. Might be feeling the feelings of someone else as they're feeling them. and the more colloquial walking a mile in someone else's shoes. All three of those are actually correct. So when you distill that into one sentence, it's about connecting and understanding where another person is coming from on an emotional or cognitive level.
Yeah, that's great. So the kind of impetus for having you come on was this study around leaders and some of the challenges they were facing. Can you share with us a little bit more about what were some of the highlights and findings, and why is this so either important or maybe even shocking today?
Yeah, absolutely. So Businessolver, which is a tech-enabled benefits platform, they have been putting out the State of Workplace Empathy Study since 2016. And it's something that I and fellow people speaking about empathy and other soft skills reference constantly. The thing that was really surprising with this year's report was how there was a noticeable increase in mental health challenges. Largely around CEOs. That was the one that was most shocking to me. 55% of CEOs reported that they had experienced anxiety, depression, loneliness, or burnout in the past year. And that actually had increased 21% since the year before, 21 points since the year before. So it went from 34% in 2023 all the way up to 55%. So the thing that's really surprising about that, half of the CEOs, half of the leaders that are out there, they're struggling with mental health issues. And we need to, as leaders, recognize that and take action so that we can show up not only for our families and in our personal life, but as importantly, in the workplace. If the leader is not functioning fully and near 100%, how in the world can they expect results from the rest of the people on their team? How can they lead effectively? And so I think that's really important for leaders to start to acknowledge and discard the shame that might be there, the stigma around mental health issues, and instead actually seek help, whatever form that actually takes.
Yeah, Rob, I think this is so important. I can't remember if I ever shared this with you, but it was 8 or 9 years ago. I did a TED Talk on the contagiousness of emotions in the workplace. And there's been a growing body of research on that since the mid-1990s, and they found that not all emotions are equally contagious. Some are more contagious than others, fear and anxiety being the most contagious. And if you're a leader, it's more like 2x or 3x.
Sure.
Because you're feeling it, then everyone else is kind of picking up on your vibe. So obviously, this is a big deal. I'm curious, though, if you have any thoughts as to why such a big bump in that number, because 55% suffering from anxiety, depression, loneliness, burnout.
Yeah,
that's a pretty big number. I'm wondering what led to that.
Really, start to look outside of yourself, your organization, and think about what's happening in the world as well as what's happening in your business and how that's influencing. I know in the report they cited some CEOs who talked about all the financial pressure that they're under. And if you think about everything that CEOs have been through since 2020 and the start of the pandemic, they just are feeling battered. And they talked about this in the report. They're really feeling beaten up and battered. And, there is that phrase that it's lonely at the top. So no surprise that they would identify with the word loneliness. The burnout, though, is also a big challenge because we're at this point where values have shifted in the United States since the pandemic. And I've done other studies looking at that and the ongoing changing values. And it's not that people don't want to work hard. They still do, but they're establishing boundaries for themselves, particularly with the younger generation. And they want to and are putting time into their family or their personal life and saying, hey, it's 6 o'clock. I kind of need to be done. So you're not seeing the same levels of work on the weekends and nights. And what's ending up happening, though, is there's still the issues of the business, and inflation was out of control in the last year. Because you have to think about okay, they said this in early 2024. They're really reflecting on their past year. So what was happening in 2023? Inflation was really high. In some industries, there were supply chain disruptions. There were still pressure from cultural issues that were going on, the workplace, a lot of tension around return to office and how to balance that out. And not everybody succeeded there. All of those things put stress on the leader that has to make those decisions as much as it's putting stress on the employees that are affected by it. So there's this combination of external factors as well as internal pressures. And hey, if you're in a publicly traded company, Wall Street still wants the results that they want. So the leader is really getting pushed and compressed, I would say, on all sides. And that, if you don't have good coping mechanisms and ways to alleviate that mental stress and anxiety, that can lead to some serious mental health challenges.
So, as you're talking, it makes me realize and think that there are just so many complicated problems and challenges that CEOs are left with. There's the context and the culture that we may be in and some of the tension around that. Trying to engage different generations in the workforce, that can be a challenge. And then the general business problem that they're trying to solve for, where you've got inflation. And so you can increase your prices, but only so much. One of my clients told me recently, they said, a very large client, and they said, we realized we basically hit the top amount we can charge for this product. We cannot charge anymore. I mean, there's only so much people are willing to pay for this particular product. It's kind of something that we all buy. And they said, so now we've got to figure out how do we figure out a way to cut costs to keep the margins properly intact.
And this has been going on for 2 years now with the consumer, and it's finally showing up in the business results. And you've seen, all of the fast food restaurants have really taken a beating lately. The retailers are really suffering. The food companies are suffering because people refuse to spend $8 for a box of Cheerios. The CEO of ConAgra, Sean Connolly, said in an article that was in the Washington Post recently, he said what they've found, and I agree with this, there are people that are changing their behaviors based on budget, but others that are changing their behaviors based on principle. Now, right. Your client that you were talking about, they've still got to hit their numbers. That you can't just give up your profit margin. So what they had done is maintained their margin by increasing their prices so that all the numbers were still making sense, so that they could still, be hopefully good to their employees and deliver value to their shareholders. But it's a rubber band. It'll only stretch so much, and we've definitely reached the breaking point. And what some of those CEOs were saying in the report, it's kind of like, what fresh hell is this? Like every week there's something new that's coming up, and like, when are they going to get a break?
Yeah, I think you set a really good kind of context for why this is so challenging for CEOs and leaders today. I think you summed up really well. There's so much financial pressure and they're just getting beaten up. And these are problems that don't have easy solutions. So let's go into the point of our conversation today. How is empathy a possible solve for this? And what can CEOs and leaders do if they find themselves in this almost untenable position and they're just the punching bag for everybody else? How can they shore themselves up and operate in a way that might be a little different?
Yeah, so it's actually about setting boundaries for themselves as well, and putting the resources in place for self-care. I think it's too easy to give up your life basically to work all the time. And, depending on the company and the situation, I think, as an entrepreneur who recently exited the company I founded, there's a lot of pressure that's there. And the CEO isn't always the highest paid person. But when you're in a larger firm, there can sometimes be that big differential. So you've got to find the people that can relate to you, that you can talk to and share. That might be somebody in your organization. It could be, at your level. It can be, if you've got a board, there's probably somebody that can mentor you or support you in that way on the board. Your HR team, quite honestly, I've always found is a really great resource. They're highly empathetic. And then find the things outside that give you some joy, and help alleviate the stress. And you get over the stigma of seeing a mental health counselor, therapist, psychiatrist. That's another big challenge in our society. I think a third of people, they said in the report, felt that there was stigma, that they were going to be seen as weak or a burden if they indicated that they had mental health issues. And the reality is we all have it. We all go through it. But when we allow that stigma to have power over us, when we allow that shame to have power over us, then it really just hurts us even more, because it's harder for us to go, deal with it. The other thing I would say, as a leader, you do have this balancing act, because you want to try to open up and be human to your team. You don't want to share things so much that they're all going to worry. But at the same time, they need to see that you're human. And there was a great quote in the report. One CEO talked about, I want people to know that, like, I'm a dad, that I make I'm paraphrasing this, but like, I make pancakes on Saturday mornings, and I'm a terrible golfer. And just see the human. The more the CEOs can start to open up a little bit about their personal life, and who they are, that's going to actually inform how the culture in the organization shows up to support them. Because the organization wants you to succeed, because if you succeed, that means they're succeeding, and everybody's going to benefit from that. But how do you use your organization for some of that support?
So you hit something that I want to go back to that I think is so important. It's true for really all of us. Definitely been true post-pandemic. Connection. And I think it's this idea that, find ways to connect. And that might be with your trusted chief people officer or HR team, could be members of the board, perhaps. It could be friends, other CEOs, other colleagues. So there's that category. But then there's also, don't be afraid to hire a professional. Maybe that's a coach, maybe that's a therapist, maybe both.
Yep.
And having someone that you can kind of let your hair down and just really be able to share all that's going on. So there's that piece to it. Then you also had another important point to it too. You said, and don't be afraid to share some of this with others, with the organization. People want to see you as a real human being, and you're modeling kind of this whole person, human-centric kind of form of leadership. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a question about this. So historically, if we were to go back in time 15 years ago, one of the big mantras was, the CEO as the corporate athlete. Okay. So it was all about, you've got to get up at 5 a.m. and, swim 8 laps. And then there's very kind of rigid and, and exercise is important. It can be helpful. Yep. But it was kind of this, it was almost like this disciplined routine that involved basically just kind of exercise, diet, and then all the rest was work. But there wasn't a lot of these other elements. So how does that concept of the CEO as a corporate athlete fit into how CEOs should operate in a healthy way today?
Well, you even mentioned the point. Exercise is really important for your mental health, and finding the time to do it, and not just on the weekends, but every day. And where do you block that time out? Diet's also important. And it doesn't mean you've got to be doing the keto diet or whatever, but the healthier you're eating, and the more aware you are of your eating habits and why you're eating what you're eating. And I'm talking about, in particular, what's coming to my mind is, I go to salty snacks when I'm feeling this way. But if I'm feeling this way, hello, ice cream and chocolate. And what are those things doing for me? And is that really, it's serving me in a moment, but it's very fleeting. So it's all about getting an understanding of yourself, and an athlete does need that. And I would look to some of the greatest athletes in the world at the Olympics. And one of the things that struck me about the Paris Olympics this year was how much, Simone Biles, she's the GOAT of gymnastics, some of the top swimmers of our day. They really were much more open about their mental health and the challenges. And you saw them. I loved, there was a photo of Simone Biles meditating by the side of the competition floor, prior to an event to get herself in focus. And you need to be able to go talk about those things. Caleb Dressel took some time off so that he could clear his head. I've taken sabbaticals when I was CEO, and it was amazing what stepping away was able to do to clear my mind and give me more perspective. But I think something else that's happening now, and in this post-pandemic period in particular, you hear a lot about the concept of masculinity and what it means to be male and the kind of old tapes. And a large number of CEOs are still male, although that's also changing. But when you think about that trope of the CEO corporate athlete, that's an old way of thinking. It doesn't have to be that way. And I would encourage people to find the things that work for them, that are in service to themselves, so that they can be in service to their organization and shareholders.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So something else we talked about, kind of even sharing a little more about ourselves, vulnerability, such a powerful unlock, and such a, maybe it's counterintuitive to us when we're a leader. I'm not supposed to be vulnerable. I'm supposed to have all the answers, right? But vulnerability can invite people in. And I think when we share a little more about ourselves, it's actually modeling and promoting empathy in the organization.
Absolutely.
Because we're doing that. So here's my question to you, Rob. Maybe there's not a right answer to this. I don't know. But we know that when we see a leader do empathy in that, or do vulnerability in that way, and it comes across so inviting, people feel so much more connected to them as a real human being. They almost want to follow them more when they share some of that stuff. But if every time they're coming in front of the organization, they're always talking about bad things going on in their life, that may be too much.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like cooking in the kitchen. We're going to cook in our empathy kitchen today, Rob. And since you're the master chef, we need to know how much is the right amount of vulnerability that actually increases the flavor, using my analogy, of credibility, versus too much vulnerability, and now we've lost the flavor of credibility. What's that sweet spot?
Yeah. So if we've been too far away from any of the vulnerability spices, we've got a pretty bland cake that we're making, or dish. Everybody needs to find the thing that's right for them, and also be aware of their organization and how this is going to reflect and show up, and be mindful of, you can't be, you cannot put your stress onto your people, because they're not going to necessarily know what to do with it, because they're not the CEO. But you can talk about, I've lost quite a few friends over the last 5 or 6 years, because I'm in my mid 50s, and that seems to be what starts to happen. And I'm very open about that when I'm grieving, and because of a loss that I've had, when I'm having, and the company I mentioned that I had founded, Ignite 360, we just exited successfully last month. And by successfully, I mean we closed the deal and we've moved on into the next phase. But through all of that, there were a few people in the organization. I mean, you can't talk about everything that's happening. So you have to find the people that are outside that you can really share what your stressors are and the emotions. But once the news did come out, and I had to tell people, the employees at least, because they were involved in coming along on the transaction, we spent time talking with each other about how we were all feeling about it. I was very conscious about, empathy is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. So you can share with yourself, you can share honestly what's happening. But the broader the message is going. So if I had an organization of thousands of people, and I don't know if you do a weekly or a monthly email out to everybody telling them what's going on, you might drop in some personal, notes, but you may not go all the way down into, oh yeah, I'm working with my therapist and we are digging into the ways that my parents, treated me, and that's led to these other things. That's not really appropriate, probably, for a broad audience. But it certainly is with the people that you're closer to. and that trusted circle of advisors. So you've got to think about it as like concentric rings. I guess if I was going to use the kitchen analogy, when you can take, and I mentioned baking earlier, you've got all the different cake pans, they can all nest inside each other. Similarly, you've got to figure out what's appropriate for your organization and for yourself, and then how far out you're going with that information.
Yeah, I love that, Rob. And I think while you were talking, I thought to myself, I could see where a leader could really model this well if they address it at a high level to say, and I have support that helps me deal with not only some of the challenges and stressors at work, but even in my personal life. And I would encourage everyone to do the same thing. You could keep it that high level.
And it will be remarkable how just by admitting as a leader, oh yeah, I'm going to therapy today. Like, don't hide it that, oh, I've got an appointment, I got to slip out. Oh yeah, I've got my weekly, monthly, whatever it is with my therapist. That alone is going to change the conversation in your organization. It's going to signal to people, oh, it's okay to mention that I'm getting help for something. And it's a gradual, unraveling process as you start to open up.
And I think what I also heard you say, which I think is a nice way to kind of thread this needle, it's almost safer and easier to talk about things in retrospect. So, for example, I'm very candid and open about this. The last 3 years have been particularly challenging for me on a personal note. Particularly around some of the family dynamics I have going on in my life. And I've got a 90-year-old dad and an 87-year-old mom, and they have a lot of needs and demands and expectations that we're trying to balance and manage well. And unfortunately, and in my extended family, the help wasn't there that I was expecting to get. And so that's been very frustrating and hard. It's almost easier to talk about things in retrospect, particularly if you're a leader, because it gives off the message to folks, I was dealing with this and I've got a path forward. I think sometimes it can get a little messier if you address it in the middle of it.
Yes.
Because it can feel uncertain and people don't want that feeling to come across from a leader like they're on shaky ground.
Absolutely.
So it's this balance of being vulnerable, but still having a sense of
yes, and I actually
I don't know what it is, but there's something about we still want to provide that message that you can count on me. I'm not gonna run away tomorrow kind of thing.
Yes, 100%. It's vulnerability is still important, and you're sharing that. And thank you for sharing. We have some of that in my own family at this point with some aging parents, and it is really challenging. You're talking about it though as you've come through it, and so you're probably reflecting. You may have some wisdom on certain situations that you've gone through versus coming in hot on a Monday morning going, oh my gosh, my ex person relative, they wouldn't do a thing this weekend and I'm so angry. That's not as helpful in that broader sort of cake pan. You're closer in circle, the people that you need to really, help you and support you, which maybe your chief people officer might be more likely people outside, your therapist, your coach. Yeah, go through, process it with them versus sharing. I don't know if anyone's described this like past tense vulnerability. It's being open and honest about things that have happened, and you can reflect and share your journey and how you worked through it, which may inspire others to do the same.
And I love the terms you use in that, because when we're reflecting on it, we're doing it from a place of kind of reflecting, but also wisdom, yep. which is, we're talking about real humanity, real human stuff, but we can also talk about kind of how we navigated through those storms versus taking the organization into the middle of the storm saying, I don't know how we're going to make it through this. It's going to be a little bit of a different kind of take. We want folks coming away from that feeling more connected, feeling like empathy is good. Mental health is okay to talk about, and feeling that sense of kind of calmness and connection and not more anxiety if they're in the middle of the stormy seas with you.
Exactly. And, thinking about those concentric circles, you start at the top, and employees will look to their leader, their manager, on how to behave. So it's really important at the top to start modeling the behavior. Like, something else that came up in that state of workplace empathy study was the high number of CEOs that admitted that there was a toxic culture in their workplace. And you're like, wait a minute, you're the CEO and you're saying you can't fix it all yourself, but you play a big part in that. And hopefully they're starting to address that as well. And the point of that is that people look to their leaders and their managers to model the behavior that they hope to see. And then hopefully everybody else is already supporting themselves, supporting one another through the trials and tribulations of life. The thing that I think people will always be surprised by is how we are not alone. No one has ever been the first to go through all these kind of general life situations, dealing with aging parents, dealing with, pesky neighbors, whatever the kind of conflicts are and issues that come up. And we can actually find support and comfort from one another when we open up and share, because then you're asking people, you're opening up, you're inviting people in to have empathy with you. And then you'll end up having empathy with them in return, because they're going to share that they've had, oh yeah, I remember when that happened 10 years ago, or I saw my parents deal with this, and this is what they did.
Yeah. Rob, this has been a great conversation. So as we start to kind of land our plane, I ask all my guests this question. So what's one practical tip that you would like to give to leaders listening today that they can start doing tomorrow that might move them further down the path of either creating more of an empathetic aura within the culture, even more acceptance of mental health and whole humanness? What is something they can start to do?
I talk a lot about courage and the courage that it takes to be empathetic. And I'm not talking about, run into a burning building courage. It's small doses of courage. So when you're thinking, oh, I'm going to pull back, to have the courage to lean in instead and take what I call the curious breath, which is taking a nice big inhale, opening your mind up, and that gives you a chance to shift how you're going to respond to something instead of just reacting. So have some courage and take the curious breath. Those are the first steps. And hopefully people will check out my book and my content, and we'll go from there.
So that was my last question for you, Rob. If people want to learn more about you, you knew exactly where I was going. We want to learn more about you, pick up a copy of your book, reach out and engage with you in any way. Where can they go?
So my book, and I know we'll have it in the show notes, but tell me more about that. It's an award-winning self-help book, Solving the Empathy Crisis One Conversation at a Time. It's available wherever you like to buy books. It's also on audiobook. I narrate it. And then, of course, an ebook. And then you can also find me, robvolpe.expert. A lot of content is there. Plus my newsletter, you can sign up for that. It's called Reading Between the Lines. It comes out every 2 weeks, and I share, and it's free, and I share content, thoughts, experiences around practical uses of empathy, successes and failures, as well as insight into human behavior and things that I'm observing in the world around us today. So a lot of the things that we've talked about on the show.
Rob, this has been absolutely great. You're a true gift. Thank you so much for the work you continue to do. And thank you for spreading the good news to everyone.
Brandon, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation and love the work that you're doing. It's so important for leaders to figure out how to grow and evolve, and so that they can be better leaders.
Thank you, my friend. I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too.
I loved my conversation with Rob. I took a full page of notes, as I usually do when I talk to Rob. I always learn something. And a few highlights from my conversation with Rob that I'd like to share. First, we talked about what it does it mean to be empathetic. And Rob gave a good definition of that. He said it's understanding other people's perspectives, their feelings, and of course, the old adage, walking in other people's shoes. And then we dove into CEOs. And the study he referenced was 55% of all CEOs are saying that they're either suffering from anxiety, depression, loneliness, or some degree of burnout. And it's because of all the pressure on them, and they're bottling that. And so our solve for that is through empathy. First, for leaders to get more connection. And we can all start doing this. Maybe it's being able to have friends and colleagues we can talk to. Maybe it's a trusted HR leader we can share information with. Maybe it's people in our personal life or a therapist or coach. Having that extra support and connection, so very important for us. Second, we talked about the importance of modeling that for the organization. Being able to say confidently and comfortably, hey, everybody, I've got support in my life to help me manage through some of the challenges. I hope you do too. And don't be afraid to say, I go see a therapist. I've got a trainer. I do things to kind of help me. Having some of those elements to model it's okay to get care and help. We don't have to be perfect. None of us are. But second, we also highlighted in there the importance of walking that line and making sure we don't take the organization on the journey with us when they're in the middle of the storm. So being able to share with the organization our experiences going through it after we're already on the other side. So it feels more like a reflection and more based on wisdom. Then the organization still sees us as not only real and human, but confident, and we've got things together. If we share with the organization what we're going through in the middle of it, it can come across potentially as more anxiety producing for the organization. Well, regardless of what you took away from the conversation, there was so many great nuggets there. And with all of our Leadership Foundry shows, the goal is, what's one thing you could take away today, take away from this show, that you can start putting in place so your team and you can start thriving starting tomorrow?